Welcome to Last Memories. I'm Timothy. Today, we're looking at the worst deaths ever recorded, and after going through every single one of these cases, not one of them went the way you would expect. From a woman who crossed the safety line and picked up a loaded tube to a neighbor sneaking into a yard and poisoning a service dog.
It was July 4th, 2018 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The kind of evening where the whole block smells like charcoal and bug spray and every other house has a flag hanging off the porch. Temperatures had been sitting in the low 90s all day, and by the time the sun started dipping, the air was still warm enough that nobody had gone inside yet. On a quiet residential street, a handful of families had gathered the way they did every year. Lawn chairs dragged to the curb, coolers between driveways, kids running through sprinklers 2 houses down. It was one of those neighborhood setups where nobody really planned it, it just kind of happened because everyone was already outside. Cheryl Goad was 44. She worked at a small billing office, the kind of job where you spend most of your day on the phone sorting out other people's paperwork. Her husband, 46, was a mechanic. They lived nearby and had walked over to join the group once the grilling started winding down. One of the neighbors, a 49-year-old guy who worked in maintenance, had put together a small firework display. Not store-bought fountains or sparklers, he had assembled his own mortar tubes using cardboard, black powder lift charges, and aerial shells pulled from retail firework kits. The tubes were set into a wooden rack on his driveway, angled upright the way they needed to be to launch properly. He had even marked a line on the pavement, roughly 15 feet back, and told everyone to stay behind it. He explained that the tubes had to stay locked in the rack because without that support, the pressure from the lift charge could split the cardboard on ignition. A few people nodded. Most were just waiting for the show. The first few shots went off fine. Shells popped up, burst in the air, and the kids screamed the way kids do. But between rounds, there were gaps. Loading each tube took time, and the pacing started to drag. Cheryl got impatient. She stepped past the marked line and walked toward the rack. The neighbor told her to stop, that one of the tubes was already loaded and ready to fire. She picked it up anyway, just grabbed it out of the rack and held it upright in front of her body. She told someone nearby to go ahead and light it so they could keep things moving. Now, here is where everything falls apart. That tube was about 12 inches long. Inside it sat a 2-inch aerial shell on top of a black powder lift charge. The fuse had been cut shorter earlier in the night to reduce the delay between shots. Without the rack, the tube had no support. It was tilted slightly in her hands, and the structural integrity of the cardboard was now entirely dependent on her grip. The neighbor told her more than once to put it back. She didn't. The fuse was lit while she was still holding the tube. It burned fast, faster than anyone expected. The shortened length meant the flame reached the lift charge almost immediately. The charge ignited, but the shell didn't clear the tube. Instead, the pressure split the cardboard along the side, and the shell burst right there at the top of the tube, inches from her upper body and head. And honestly, it's unsettling to know how close she was to the danger without even realizing it. Witnesses described a loud pop, a flash of smoke, and pieces of the tube scattering across the driveway. Cheryl dropped to the ground instantly and did not move. She never responded. By the time county responders arrived, there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Fire officials examined what was left of the device and confirmed the tube had been removed from the launch rack before ignition. Multiple witnesses gave consistent statements. She had crossed the safety line on her own, picked up the loaded tube despite being warned, and refused to put it back. Investigators also noted the shortened fuse and the lack of support at the time of firing. The components were consistent with consumer-grade fireworks, but the way the device was handled at the moment of ignition created the failure. No charges were filed. The death was ruled accidental firework misuse. What stays with me is how small the window was. She was warned not to cross the line, told the tube was loaded, and told more than once to put it back. Each one a chance to walk away. But impatience doesn't feel dangerous. It just feels like moving things along. And sometimes that's all it takes. It was November 19th, 2018, in Dayton, Ohio. The neighborhood along North Main Street was quiet after midnight. A cold front had settled across the city, dropping temperatures into the low 20s. Inside one aging duplex, a bedroom window glowed faintly. Nothing outside suggested the bed inside had been heating continuously for hours. That night, inside the duplex, lived Carl Dempsey, 58. He had spent 30 years as a licensed electrician working on commercial wiring across Montgomery County. Most of his work involved repairing damaged panels and running conduit through old warehouses. Co-workers remembered him as careful with tools and patient with apprentices learning the trade. After retiring early from a back injury, Carl settled into a quiet routine repairing small appliances for neighbors. Winters aggravated the pain in his lower spine, so he took prescription muscle relaxants and slept with an electric blanket he had owned for nearly 20 years. That Monday evening brought the first cold snap of the season. Carl returned from a pharmacy run shortly after dark. Overnight temperatures were expected to drop into the 20s, and the duplex heater struggled to keep the bedroom warm. He turned the electric blanket on high and left it running through the night. The blanket was an older model with thin heating wires and a small thermostat inside the control box. Investigators later found the temperature switch had failed in a closed position, allowing constant electrical current to flow through the heating elements. Carl turned the dial to its highest setting around 11 p.m. and lay down with the blanket across his torso and legs. The medication made him drowsy within minutes as the heating wires continued running without cycling off. While Carl slept, electricity continued flowing through the internal wires. The heating elements gradually warmed the bedding and the area beneath his body, with his weight pressing the blanket between his back and the mattress. Heat dissipated slowly into the surrounding foam and fabric. Investigators later noted that the mattress and bedding acted as insulation, trapping heat close to the body for several hours. Carl remained asleep through the night. Medical records confirmed that the medication he had taken can reduce awareness and slow the body's response to rising temperature. At approximately 6:40 a.m., a neighbor noticed Carl's car still parked outside and his porch light on from the night before. Concerned, she knocked on the door repeatedly with no response. She called the property manager, who arrived with a spare key about 15 minutes later. When the bedroom door opened, the room felt noticeably warmer than the rest of the duplex. Carl was lying in the center of the bed beneath the blanket. Paramedics were called immediately and arrived within 9 minutes, but they confirmed he had already died several hours earlier. The county coroner conducted the autopsy and documented findings consistent with prolonged overheating during sleep. The report noted dehydration and organ damage consistent with prolonged overheating, with no signs of burns or fire. The official cause of death was hyperthermia from continuous electrical heating. Investigators confirmed the blanket's thermostat had failed, allowing the heating elements to run without cycling off. The blanket model had previously received consumer safety warnings for thermostat malfunctions. Carl likely bought it years before the notice. His sister later helped distribute recall notices to local thrift stores and kept the blanket's control switch sealed as evidence. It was May 12, 2018. Morning clouds drifted slowly across Angel's Landing inside Zion National Park, Utah. The sandstone ridge looked calm from a distance. Chains lined parts of the route, but long stretches of exposed rock remained only a few feet wide, where small missteps had already caused accidents. Among the early hikers, Emily Carter, 22, climbed the trail with 3 college friends from Las Vegas. She studied marketing at a local university and managed social media pages for small clothing shops on the side. Her phone was always in her hand. She tracked follower counts closely and planned posts around travel and weekend hikes. She had started hiking the desert parks the year before. Most of her photos were taken near overlooks where sheer cliffs and red rock formations created dramatic backgrounds. Friends described her as organized during classes but impatient when taking photos outdoors. The goal was usually to capture an image that would stand out online. That Saturday trip was planned for sunrise content. Angel's Landing was popular because the summit ridge formed a narrow path with steep drops on both sides. Park rangers often warned visitors that sections of the ridge were exposed and slippery, especially where sand collected on the sandstone. Similar warnings appeared on park signs and hiking forums. The group reached the upper ridge shortly after 6 a.m. Light wind moved across the exposed rock. Small patches of desert grass grew from cracks in the sandstone where sand had collected over time. The path narrowed to only a few feet wide. Visitors ahead of them stepped carefully around each other while stopping for photos. Several hikers nearby paused as Emily moved along the ridge. Many people stopped along the narrow trail to photograph the canyon below. The spot where she stopped had a small desert shrub growing beside the rock edge, about knee-height, its roots partly exposed in sandy soil trapped between stones. She stepped toward the outer edge of the ridge, where the slope dropped steeply toward rocks below. The plan was to lean slightly outward for a photo. With her phone in one hand, she reached for the shrub with the other to steady herself. The plant was not anchored deeply into the rock. Its roots spread through a shallow pocket of sand sitting on smooth sandstone. As Emily leaned outward, the soil around the roots shifted and began to crumble. Several hikers later described seeing the shrub tilt slightly away from the rock. The roots loosened with a small clump of sand attached. Emily held onto the plant as it pulled free. Her weight shifted backward toward the open drop. The movement happened quickly. With both hands gripping the uprooted shrub, she could not reach for the rock surface or nearby chain. The loose root ball swung downward and pulled her off balance. She fell backward over the edge and dropped onto a lower rock ledge before sliding farther down the steep sandstone slope. Hikers nearby shouted for help and began calling park emergency dispatch from the ridge. Several people carefully moved down toward the ledge, while others guided rangers toward the location. Zion's search and rescue teams arrived from the trailhead about 30 minutes later and descended the slope with ropes, but Emily was already unresponsive on the rock below. The county medical examiner later ruled the cause of death severe head trauma from a fall from height. The first impact against the rock caused severe head trauma, consistent with a high-impact fall onto hard rock. Investigators later examined the location where the fall occurred. The shrub near the edge had been pulled completely from the shallow sand pocket, leaving only bare sandstone beneath. The narrow ridge and unstable footing were identified as key factors in the fall, reinforcing park warnings that vegetation growing from cracks along exposed ridges cannot be relied upon for support. It was August 18, 2019. On Detroit's east side, a cleared block of former storefronts sat behind temporary fencing, graded flat for new construction. An automated concrete printer moved along steel rails, laying thick gray lines across a slab where structural walls were planned. The project was led by Travis Knox, 39, a local developer known for buying distressed properties and converting them into compact apartment units. He worked under tight budgets and strict timelines. The block once included a locksmith shop run by Arthur Mendez, 71. 6 months earlier, Knox's company acquired the property through foreclosure, and Mendez lost the shop he had operated for decades. The dispute led to civil filings and tense exchanges at public meetings. That afternoon, Knox scheduled a walkthrough for investors. The printer had already begun forming the first structural columns. A supervisor noted minor sensor issues caused by dust and suggested pausing operations, but Knox chose to keep the system running to demonstrate progress. Access logs later showed the control software had been entered the previous evening using credentials assigned to Arthur Mendez, who had been granted temporary access weeks earlier to remove fixtures from his former shop. Investigators found several proximity sensors had been disabled, and the emergency stop delay extended by several seconds. Because the changes were made through authorized credentials, the system did not flag them. At 3:42 p.m., Knox stepped inside the marked boundary to demonstrate how closely the printer could operate near a corner. 2 investors stood near the fence, and a laborer remained by the mixing truck. A phone mounted on the fence recorded the walkthrough, and a fixed camera captured the active zone from above. The nozzle moved at waist height, laying a band of wet mix. As Knox stood near the inside angle of a forming wall, the printer arm pivoted and advanced. Under normal settings, the proximity system would have paused the motion. It did not. Knox stepped backward, but earlier layers, nearly 18 inches high, confined him in the corner. The nozzle advanced into his space, pinning him against the partially formed wall. The pump continued feeding concrete at a steady rate. Wet concrete accumulated around his boots as the printer continued laying layers. As additional passes were completed, the material built upward, gradually trapping his lower body. A subsequent programmed pass deposited material across his midsection, further restricting movement. Workers pressed the emergency stop at 3:44 p.m., but the printer continued briefly before shutting down. By then, the concrete had reached his chest, restricting movement and breathing. Emergency services were called immediately. Fire crews arrived within minutes and began removing sections that were still soft, but the lower portion had already begun to harden. Using cutting tools and shovels, crews freed him from the partially formed column. Paramedics assessed him and found no pulse. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was traumatic asphyxia caused by compressive force. The weight and pressure of the concrete prevented his lungs from expanding, leading to suffocation. The report also documented rib fractures and crushing injuries to the lower torso. The manner of death was ruled homicide, after forensic engineers confirmed the safety systems had been intentionally altered. Arthur Mendez was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 25 years. Construction stopped immediately, and the partially formed structure was removed and preserved as evidence before the site was cleared.
It was July 22, 2018, at a regional amusement park in Ohio, running at full summer capacity. The heat had been pressing down on the asphalt since mid-morning, the kind that radiates back up off the pavement and makes the air between the rides shimmer slightly. Tyler Marsh, 24, worked as a warehouse coordinator for a logistics company in the area. He had come to the park with a friend to unwind after a full week of work. During my research, I discovered that the last clear frame before the overexposure, he was relaxed, filming short clips on his phone and sending them to friends. There was nothing worried or hesitant about him. He was just a young man having a normal summer day, and the coaster was the next ride on the list. And this is the thing about Tyler's story that separates it from every other case in this video. He was the one holding the camera. He was filming himself. The coaster had one lap bar per seat. Each rider pulled it down by hand, and a ratchet locked it in place. A sensor checked each bar before the train could leave. Two operators worked the platform, one walking along the row of seats to check each bar and one standing at the control panel. Tyler sat down and pulled the lap bar down with one hand while holding his phone with the other. He gave a thumbs up to his friend still on the platform and raised his phone to film the start of the ride. The restraint appeared locked during checks, but it had not fully engaged. From above, the bar looked secure and the system registered it as locked, but it was not secured enough to hold under upward force. The operator reached Tyler's seat during the walkthrough, checked the bar by eye, and gave it a quick push. It did not move. Nothing looked wrong. The train was cleared and sent. The first part of the ride ran normally. Tyler stayed in the seat. The bar held him in place through the early section because those forces were pushing him down into the seat rather than pulling him up out of it. As the train climbed, there was a slight shift between his body and the restraint. Then the ride hit the first airtime hill. Airtime hills push riders up out of their seats. The lap bar is the only thing holding them in. On every other seat on the train, the bar held. On Tyler's seat, the restraint gave way the moment the upward force hit it. His body came up out of the seat and he was thrown from the car at full speed. He fell from the ride structure and hit the ground below. The fall was from a significant height, and the speed of the train at the point of ejection meant he was not simply dropping vertically. The impact caused fatal traumatic injuries, including severe trauma to the head and torso. He did not survive the impact. Park staff found him on the ground under the track after riders on the train and people on the midway below started screaming. The ride kept going through the rest of the course while the operator worked out what had happened, then brought it to an emergency stop as the train came into the final section. Park staff reached the scene and called emergency services. The area was cleared and secured. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life at the scene. By the time they got to the high-speed coaster at the back of the park, he had already been on several other rides. The medical examiner later recorded the cause of death as multiple blunt force traumatic injuries consistent with ejection from a moving ride and impact with the ground from height. Investigators found the lap bar had not fully engaged despite passing initial checks, and was not able to hold under upward load. The train had been cleared without the bar reaching full lock. Ride operations were shut down immediately, and a full inspection of the restraint system and operator procedures was started. And the part I found tragic is the phone Tyler was filming on went down with him.
It was March 6, 2017, in Bakersfield, California. The mornings were still cool and the industrial streets near the highway were quiet before 7. Raymond Schultz, 58, had operated a small auto repair shop on Oleander Avenue for 19 years. Before opening the garage, he had spent more than a decade working as a mechanic in larger service centers across Bakersfield, building a reputation for careful work and straightforward pricing. Many customers returned year after year, trusting him with both routine maintenance and major repairs. Raymond opened the shop himself every morning before staff arrived, switching on the lights and unlocking the tool cabinets before the workday began. Among the mechanics he hired that winter was Darren Cole, 29. Problems surfaced quickly. He arrived late, ignored routine procedures, and had several disputes with other staff. Raymond warned him more than once about following shop rules, and co-workers later told investigators they had grown uneasy working with him. By mid-February, Raymond had begun considering dismissal. The decision came on February 18th. After closing, Cole remained inside the garage and took a customer's 2013 Chevrolet Silverado from the service bay without authorization. The truck had been brought in for brake work and was scheduled for pickup the next morning. After driving it for roughly 2 hours, Cole returned and struck a curb while turning into the lot, damaging the front suspension. Raymond discovered the damage the following morning. Cole admitted what he had done and was dismissed immediately. Several days later, Cole returned to collect his final paycheck. Raymond told him the truck's repairs had already cost the shop thousands of dollars and said he intended to deduct the amount from Cole's wages. Cole argued that the amount he was owed exceeded the repair cost and demanded to be paid in full. The exchange grew heated in the parking lot before Raymond ended the conversation and walked back inside the building. Cole left without receiving the check. During the weeks he had worked in the garage, Cole had learned how the building operated. Each service bay had a ventilation system that removed exhaust fumes when engines ran indoors. Late on the night of March 5th, Cole returned to the property after closing. He entered through a side door that mechanics often used after hours, switched off the ventilation control unit, and started a customer vehicle left overnight in the center bay. With the fan disabled, exhaust fumes gradually filled the enclosed garage as carbon monoxide accumulated throughout the building. Cole exited through the same door and pulled it shut behind him. Raymond arrived at approximately 6:40 a.m. the following morning, carrying his coffee and keys. He unlocked the side door and stepped into the garage. Within minutes, he collapsed onto the concrete floor near the front of the vehicle. No other employees had arrived yet. Shortly after 8 a.m., one of the shop's mechanics arrived for work and found Raymond lying on the concrete floor. He immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived minutes later and found Raymond unresponsive. Carbon monoxide levels inside the garage were measured at several times the concentration known to cause rapid incapacitation. Raymond Schultz was pronounced dead at the scene later that morning. Investigators found the ventilation control switched off and the center bay vehicle still running. Security camera footage recorded Darren Cole entering the property the previous night and leaving 14 minutes later. Cole was arrested 4 days later and charged with second-degree murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison. It was November 20th, 2015, a gray Friday evening in suburban Ohio, the kind of town where the stoplights outnumber the restaurants and most people drive the same route home without thinking twice. The intersection sat where a 4-lane highway met a smaller cross street. Pavement was dry, visibility was fine, rush hour had thinned out. Just another evening where everyone was trying to get somewhere warm. Deanna Spiff was 38, worked as a clerk at a nearby warehouse, and by most accounts had an opinion about everything, and made sure you heard it. She wasn't the type to back down when someone told her what to do. She'd been written up more than once for arguing with supervisors over policies she thought were stupid. The kind of person who, if you told her the floor was wet, would walk across it faster just to prove she could. That night, she left the warehouse with 2 co-workers in a compact sedan. Deanna took the front passenger seat. Now here's where the decisions start to stack up. Except with Deanna, they weren't small. They were loud. The driver reminded everyone to buckle up. Deanna told him not to tell her what to do, said she'd been riding in cars since before he had a license. The driver pushed back. His car, his rule. Deanna grabbed the seatbelt, made a show of pulling it across her chest, then deliberately tucked the strap behind her back without clicking it in. She looked right at him while she did it, like compliance was beneath her. The driver let it go. Most people do when someone turns a seatbelt into a power struggle. But Deanna wasn't done. She spent the drive complaining. The temperature, the route, the warehouse changing the brake schedule without asking her. She told the driver he was going too slow, then too close to the car ahead. She changed the radio without asking. When the driver adjusted it back, she called him controlling. This matters, not because the argument caused the crash, but because it paints someone who had made defiance a reflex. Every rule was an insult. The seatbelt wasn't a strap she forgot to click. It was a line she refused to let someone else draw. The car was doing about 40, approaching an intersection with a green light. No reason to slow down, and then another vehicle entered the intersection against a red light. No buildup, no screeching tires. It struck the sedan directly on the front passenger side, Deanna's side, at 40 miles per hour without a seatbelt. The physics are brutal. Her body moved forward on impact. Her head struck the dashboard and windshield. The force threw her sideways into the door frame. She lost consciousness instantly. The crash folded around her in a way that the belt, the one she'd turned into a statement, was designed to prevent. The driver and rear passenger, both belted, survived with minor injuries. That's what makes this case unbearable. Two people in the same wreck walked away because of a 3-second decision Deanna refused to make. Not forgot, refused, same car, same crash. The only difference was a click and the pride that wouldn't allow it. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Deanna was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The police report listed the absent seatbelt as a direct contributing factor. The other driver was cited for running the red light. No further charges filed. A warehouse shift, a short drive, a belt tucked behind the seat to win an argument no one else was having, and a light someone else decided to run. What gets me isn't the crash itself. It's that she had the one thing that could have saved her in her hands, and shoved it behind her back because someone suggested she use it. The danger wasn't the intersection. It was the attitude that no rule and no person had the right to tell her what was good for her. The rear passenger walked away with bruises. The driver went home that night. Deanna didn't. The only variable was a seatbelt waiting for a click that her pride wouldn't allow. She didn't die from ignorance. She died from defiance. The seatbelt wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And physics doesn't bend for that.
It was February 12, 2015, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. A rental house on a quiet block sat under thin clouds and frost. Street salt lined the curb. Inside, weak daylight filtered through closed blinds while the furnace cycled. In the living room, a powered massage chair continued running. Marcus Hill, 34, had just finished a night shift at a regional distribution warehouse outside the city. He worked as a forklift operator loading palletized freight onto trailers scheduled to leave before sunrise. Supervisors described him as reliable and quiet, the type of worker who kept a steady pace and rarely missed a shift. Marcus lived alone in the small rental house. His 2 children stayed across town with their mother, but their drawings were taped to the refrigerator door, and school pickup dates were written on a calendar beside the stove. Neighbors often saw him returning shortly after sunrise during weeks when he worked overnight rotations. Earlier that winter, Marcus bought a used massage chair from a discount warehouse that handled returned furniture. The chair was large and upholstered in black vinyl with heating pads and motorized rollers that moved along the backrest. A power cord ran from the chair to a wall outlet beside the couch. Marcus arrived home just after 6 a.m., following a 12-hour shift. Outside temperatures were below freezing. The heater had been running overnight. He reheated leftovers, placed his laptop on a side table, and sat down in the massage chair. The control panel showed the back massage cycle and seat heater active. Marcus leaned back and let the rollers move slowly along his spine. He was still wearing his warehouse uniform and a stainless steel bracelet around his right wrist. Investigators later determined the chair's power cord had been damaged where it entered the base of the armrest. The insulation had worn away, exposing part of the internal live wire. The chair's metal frame ran directly beneath the same seam. Marcus drifted asleep while the massage program continued. At some point after the video on his laptop finished playing, his right arm slid along the armrest seam. Investigators later determined the damaged wire had energized part of the chair's metal frame beneath the cushion. When Marcus's wrist and bracelet came into contact with the energized section of the armrest, electrical current passed through his arm and across his chest. Because his arm rested firmly against the armrest, the bracelet remained pressed against the energized section of the chair. Investigators later noted the contact likely lasted long enough for electrical current to disrupt the heart's rhythm. The massage chair continued running through the morning. Marcus remained seated with his head tilted back and his arm resting along the armrest. The laptop screen dimmed after the video ended. Nothing in the room appeared disturbed. He was not discovered until that afternoon. When Marcus failed to respond to a call about a shift change, a coworker contacted the property manager. A neighbor used a spare key and dialed 911 at 3:12 p.m. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found Marcus still seated in the chair. The medical examiner later ruled the death an accidental electrocution. The report determined electrical current entered through the wrist, where the bracelet contacted exposed wiring and traveled across the chest. The autopsy documented a small electrical burn on the wrist and a matching arc mark inside the bracelet. The heart showed findings consistent with sudden electrical disruption of its rhythm. The chair was removed as evidence and the case was closed as an accidental electrical death. It was October 14, 2017, in Black Canyon of the Gunnison, Colorado. Dusk settled over the steep canyon walls as the air cooled along the rim. A restricted overlook sat quiet above the Gunnison River, 1,800 feet below. From the edge, the canyon looked open, but a thin survey cable stretched across the span. Elias Novak, 29, lived in Grand Junction and worked weekdays driving a forklift at a warehouse that handled building supplies. On weekends, he filmed outdoor activities, climbing routes, bike trails, and occasional skydives. Friends described him as methodical with gear. He kept printed checklists and often modified inexpensive equipment to improve it. His experience came mostly from legal skydives, where he practiced controlling parachutes during descent. Over time, he began considering shorter drops that required faster deployment and precise canopy control. He spent months reading base jump forums and studying site maps. He practiced canopy drills from bridge jumps with experienced jumpers, but had never completed a cliff jump legally. That evening, he hiked along a closed trail toward a ledge above the river. Warning signs marked unstable edges and falling rock hazards. His printed maps showed an old USGS gauging cable once stretched across the canyon, though its current status was unclear. As the light faded toward twilight, several hikers on nearby overlooks later reported seeing him preparing gear near the rim. Witnesses described him checking an altimeter on his wrist and adjusting the pilot chute pouch on the back of his rig. Air along the rim had grown calmer as the sun dropped behind the cliffs. Around 7:10 p.m., he stood near the edge where a strip of tape marked a takeoff point sometimes used by previous jumpers. A few hikers remained on the opposite overlook across the canyon. One later told investigators that a faint horizontal glint briefly crossed the shadowed rock face before disappearing again. From above, the canyon still appeared empty. At approximately 7:12 p.m., witnesses saw him step forward and launch from the ledge. His body moved outward with arms tucked as he tracked across open air. Seconds later, the parachute deployed and the canopy opened fully. Observers on the opposite rim said the glide initially appeared stable as he moved across the canyon. Moments later, his flight path intersected with a thin steel gauging cable stretched across the canyon. The cable measured roughly 3/8 of an inch thick and was anchored under heavy tension between fixtures on both rims. The wire did not shift when struck. Witnesses described the canopy jerking violently as the lines caught the cable, abruptly stopping part of the harness while his body continued forward. The impact caused catastrophic injuries as his body struck the tensioned cable at speed. The harness remained entangled on the wire while his body lost momentum and dropped toward the steep talus slope below. Visitors on the opposite rim immediately called for help after the collision. Park rangers reached the nearest access point soon afterward and secured the overlook, while search teams descended toward the slope beneath the cable. Elias was located on the rocks above the river and pronounced dead at the scene. The county coroner later ruled the cause of death massive blunt force trauma and internal injuries sustained during the mid-air collision with the cable. The tensioned steel wire acted like a fixed barrier when struck at high speed, causing fatal injuries instantly. In the following weeks, park crews mapped several abandoned research cables still crossing parts of the canyon and began removing those no longer in use. Investigators also documented witness statements and photographs taken from nearby overlooks as part of the final report. It was September 3rd, 2017. Inside a large convention arena on the outskirts of Las Vegas, stage lights and crowd noise filled the venue, while the service corridors behind it remained controlled and quiet. In one of those hallways, security cameras recorded a routine escort that lasted seconds before a single act ended a career and a life. Earlier that afternoon, Adrian Sloan, 27, known online as Viper, finished a semi-final match before thousands of spectators. He grew up in suburban Arizona and built his career streaming first-person shooter games from a small bedroom setup. By his mid-20s, he had signed with a professional team, traveling year-round and earning income from sponsors and tournaments. His name later appeared in civil filings tied to online misconduct allegations involving minors. One complaint was dismissed, and another remained pending, and he continued competing while the cases moved through court. Professional esports tournaments operate like broadcast sporting events. Players move between the stage and media rooms through restricted service corridors, escorted by security to prevent fan contact. Ceiling-mounted cameras record continuously. The hallway measured about 8 feet wide, with concrete floors and metal service doors spaced every few yards. Working that shift was Leo Ramirez, 53, a maintenance employee assigned to custodial duties. Court records later identified him as the father of a 19-year-old woman who had filed a misconduct complaint against Sloan the previous year. Ramirez had no prior violent history and reported for his shift at 6 a.m., completing routine cleaning tasks throughout the day. Security logs show Sloan was scheduled to move from the main stage to a press room at 8:42 p.m. 2 contracted guards escorted him through Corridor C toward the media suites. Ramirez's cleaning assignment placed him near a trash bin along that path. He wore a visible staff badge and pushed a gray cart stocked with supplies. Because the corridor was considered secure, only limited staff were permitted inside during escorted movements. Cameras covered both the entrance and midpoint of the hallway, creating 2 recorded angles before and during the incident. There were no active alerts tied to Sloan's movement. At 8:43 p.m., Sloan was walking between the guards, holding a water bottle. A separate camera at the corridor entrance captured the escort seconds earlier, establishing his route. Ramirez stepped away from the trash bin and reaches into the lower compartment of his cart. He removes a gas-powered construction nailer, a tool designed to drive steel fasteners at high speed. From less than 2 feet away, he fires once. The steel fastener enters Sloan's left eye socket and penetrates the skull. One guard restrains Ramirez while the other attempts to assist Sloan. The nailer falls to the concrete floor. Sloan collapses immediately, motionless on the corridor floor. Emergency services were called immediately. On-site medical personnel arrived within minutes and began resuscitation, but Sloan showed no purposeful movement. Officers secured the corridor and detained Ramirez without resistance. Sloan was transported to a nearby trauma hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner reported penetrating cranial trauma. Investigators reported the fastener entered through the eye socket and penetrated the brain, causing catastrophic damage and rapid blood loss. The injuries were described as rapidly fatal. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Prosecutors charged Leo Ramirez with open murder with use of a deadly weapon and possession of a weapon at a public event. In 2019, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison, with parole eligibility after 10 years. Court findings described the attack as retaliatory. Event organizers later revised staff access controls and escort procedures.
It was February 14th, 2019, inside a large shopping complex in Manchester, England, in the middle of the day. The corridors were busy with lunchtime foot traffic, the kind of steady, directionless movement that builds in commercial spaces during the midday window when office workers spill out and blend with regular shoppers. Noah Lee, 27, worked at an office a short walk from the complex. He had used his lunch break to collect a pre-ordered item from one of the stores on the upper floor. He had been in a relationship for 3 years and had spent the past week planning a proposal for that evening. The item he was collecting was part of it. He had ordered it several days earlier and received the collection notification that morning. His phone was in his hand. He was checking his messages as he walked, confirming the collection details, the way most people do when they are between one thing and the next and not yet fully present in either. I want to say something here before we go any further. Noah was not distracted in any unusual sense. He was doing what almost everyone does in a busy shopping complex on a lunch break, phone in hand, mind already at the next thing.
He approached the escalator without slowing down. His eyes were on his screen. The escalator entrance was standard. A metal comb plate at the base, steps emerging in sequence from beneath the floor, handrails moving in sync on both sides at the same speed as the steps. The approach was open and unobstructed. There was no queue. An overhead CCTV camera mounted above the entrance angled downward across the approach zone and the first few steps, capturing the full boarding area. Noah stepped forward without looking down. His foot landed partially on the first moving step while the rear of his shoe was still making contact with the stationary floor. The step continued moving beneath him immediately, drawing his weight forward faster than his body could respond. He had no hand on the handrail. There was nothing to arrest the shift. His head struck the edge of the metal comb plate as he came down into the base of the escalator. The comb plate is the fixed metal component where the moving steps emerge from beneath the floor. It sits low and protrudes at an angle, and in a forward fall with no effective bracing. The impact was immediate and severe. His skull fractured on contact. The escalator kept running beneath him as he lay at the base of it, the steps moving past him, while the people around him slowly understood what they were seeing. This is the part that I find hardest to explain to people who have not seen footage like this. It does not look like a fatal accident when it starts. It looks like someone losing their footing, and then it is over. Nearby shoppers saw him go down and reacted within seconds. People called out. Someone moved toward the emergency stop panel mounted on the side wall near the base. The escalator continued running for a few seconds before it was halted. Emergency services were contacted immediately by multiple people. Paramedics arrived and found Noah unresponsive. He was assessed and stabilized at the scene as far as possible before being transported to hospital. He did not regain consciousness. Noah Lee died from his injuries. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic brain injury with skull fracture, consistent with direct high-force impact to the escalator comb plate during a forward fall. The item he had collected for the proposal was recovered among his belongings. CCTV footage reviewed during the subsequent investigation showed the sequence in full. He spent a week planning that evening, but he never made it back. The person he meant to propose to hear what happened from someone else. I still wonder how she felt hearing that news.
It was July 19, 2014, in Portland, Oregon. The summer heat had settled over the city, and most people in the neighborhood kept their windows open through the evening. Sandra Ellis, 31, had lived in a two-bedroom apartment on Southeast Morrison Street for 3 years. She worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic a few miles away and managed the apartment lease in her name. The rent, utilities, and building correspondence all ran through her. Earlier that year, she had agreed to let a friend named Josh Lowe, 28, move into the second bedroom. The arrangement was informal. His name did not appear on the lease. He contributed a fixed amount toward rent each month, which Sandra used to offset her costs. For the first few months, the arrangement worked without obvious problems. By spring, Josh had fallen behind. One payment arrived 2 weeks late. The next came in short by half. Sandra addressed the issue directly each time, keeping the conversations calm but clear. She depended on the contribution to cover what she owed the building. By early July, with another full month unpaid, she told him plainly that if the balance was not settled within 2 weeks, he would need to find somewhere else to live. Sandra had lived with a severe peanut allergy throughout her adult life. The condition had been formally documented by her physician, and she carried an epinephrine auto-injector with her at all times. A second injector was kept in a kitchen drawer as a backup. Josh had known about the allergy before he moved in. She had explained the risk clearly when the living arrangement was first discussed, and peanut products were never kept in the apartment because of the risk. On the evening of July 18th, another conversation about rent turned into an argument. Josh said the timeline was unreasonable. Sandra responded that the situation could not continue without payment, and that she needed either a firm commitment or a move-out date. The discussion ended without resolution. Shortly afterward, Sandra left the apartment to visit a friend. Earlier that afternoon, she had prepared a container of rice and vegetables and placed it in the refrigerator for dinner when she returned. Josh remained in the apartment alone for several hours and mixed peanut residue into the container. Sandra arrived home shortly after 9 p.m. She reheated the meal, sat down at the kitchen table, and ate without any indication that the food had been altered. Within minutes, she began experiencing symptoms consistent with a severe allergic reaction. Her throat tightened and her breathing became labored. She retrieved the epinephrine injector from the kitchen drawer and administered it before calling 911. Paramedics arrived and transported her to a nearby hospital, but the reaction continued to escalate despite treatment, and she died hours later. Medical staff later confirmed the cause as anaphylactic shock triggered by peanut exposure. Laboratory analysis of the remaining food identified peanut residue mixed into the container. Investigators determined that Josh had been alone in the apartment with unrestricted access to the refrigerator during the hours Sandra was away. His fingerprints were recovered from the container lid. Combined with the earlier argument and his documented knowledge of Sandra's allergy, the evidence became central to the case. Josh Lowe was arrested 6 days later and charged with second-degree murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison. It was August 9th, 2018 in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Morning light crossed cool air as steam drifted over pale mineral ground. Boardwalk rails creaked under steady visitors. A sulfur smell hung over the basin. From above, the crust looked dry and solid, though thin vents pulsed nearby and warning signs lined the railing. Earlier that morning, Sarah Linton, 31, walked along the boardwalks with a small pack and a mirrorless camera. She lived in Boise and worked as a freelance travel photographer supplying images to small nature blogs and travel pages. Her work focused on quiet scenes and simple frames. She planned routes carefully and often worked early to avoid crowds. She had come to photograph geothermal features at sunrise for a series scheduled later that month. Her notes listed several vents and terraces along that section of the park. Spare batteries sat in a belt pouch. A folded tripod was clipped to her pack, and 2 lenses were wrapped in cloth inside the main compartment. By mid-morning, the light grew stronger, and steam rising from a restricted basin thickened. She shifted from wide shots to close details of mineral patterns near the ground. As she changed lenses, a plastic cap slipped from her hand and rolled past the boardwalk onto the pale crust below. From where she stood, the ground looked flat and dry. Heat shimmered lightly above the surface, and thin steam drifted across the basin. Posted signs at the entrance warned visitors to remain on boardwalks because geothermal basins can form thin crust over extremely hot water. Ranger notices nearby repeated the warning about unstable ground around vents. The air carried a stronger sulfur smell. Sarah raised the camera strap higher on her shoulder, stepped over the rail, and moved carefully toward the cap. She set one boot down, then the other, pressing lightly with her toes before shifting weight forward. The crust dipped slightly but held. She took another step, eyes on the cap lying in the dust. Steam drifted slowly across the basin floor. On the 4th step, the ground broke. The crust snapped with a sharp cracking sound, and her right leg dropped straight through to the thigh. The brittle surface fractured outward around the opening and collapsed beneath her weight. Thick mud and water surged upward from below, covering her boot and shin while hot vapor rose from the new break. She dropped to her hands to stop herself from sinking farther, but the surrounding crust continued breaking. Within seconds, she sank to her waist in a dense slurry of mud and near boiling geothermal water. Measured close to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, people standing along the boardwalk heard her cry out as she tried to pull herself free. Emergency services were called immediately, and several visitors reached over the rail and pulled her back onto the boardwalk while they waited for rangers to arrive. Rangers and paramedics reached the basin within minutes. Thick mud clung to her legs and continued releasing heat even after she was pulled onto the boardwalk. Her clothing and boots held the slurry against the skin, prolonging exposure. Medical teams recorded severe thermal burns covering about 40% of her body, mainly on the legs, hips, and lower torso. The hot slurry destroyed multiple layers of tissue, while the mineral-rich geothermal water further damaged exposed skin. Despite fluids and rapid treatment, her body entered shock. She was airlifted to a regional burn center but died later that evening from complications of extensive thermal burns and shock. A later examination confirmed the burns were external, with no thermal injury to the airways. The basin was temporarily closed while rangers documented the site. Measurements showed a crust only 2 inches thick above boiling mud and water, with fracture lines spreading from the point where she stepped.
It was June 12th, 2016, a Sunday afternoon in Arizona, the kind of day where the heat starts early and doesn't let up. By midday, it was well over 100 degrees outside, the kind of dry, pressing heat that pushes everyone indoors or toward the nearest body of water. The hotel was a mid-range place off a state highway, the type families book for a weekend getaway because it has a pool and a continental breakfast. Nothing resort level, just clean rooms, a parking lot, and a fenced-in pool area between the main building and the back lot. Glenda Quell was 40 years old. She worked as a receptionist at a small office in town and was raising 2 kids on her own, ages 6 and 8. By all accounts, she was the kind of mom who stretched every dollar to make sure her kids had a good time. This trip was one of those efforts, a weekend away from routine, a pool, ice from the machine down the hall, simple stuff that means everything when you're 8. They checked in earlier that day. The kids had been talking about the pool since the car ride, so after settling into the room, Glenda grabbed towels and headed down with both of them. Here's where it turns. The pool area was closed. The gate had a sign on it that read clearly, "Do not enter wet surface." Staff had been cleaning the deck, and the tile around the pool was still soaked. Not damp, wet, the kind of wet where you can see the sheen on the surface from 10 feet away. Glenda opened the gate and walked in anyway. She had the towels over her arm and both kids behind her. A staff member saw them enter and told her directly that the deck was still wet and the area wasn't open yet. According to that staff member's account, Glenda acknowledged it but kept walking. Maybe she figured she'd just set up and wait for it to dry. Maybe she thought wet tile wasn't that serious. I don't know what was going through her head, but she made the decision to stay. I understand the instinct, a parent trying to give her kids a pool day. But the warning was clear, and she chose to ignore it. That's what makes it hard to sit with. Now I need you to picture this pool deck. Standard hotel layout, rectangular pool, maybe 30 feet long with a concrete lip around the edge and tile extending out about 6 feet on each side. The tile was a smooth, light-colored material, the kind that's fine when it's dry but turns into something close to ice when there's a film of water on it. And the whole surface was covered. Glenda walked along the side of the pool, heading toward the far corner where the lounge chairs were stacked. She was stepping around the corner of the pool where the deck narrows slightly. One foot came down on the wet tile and slipped. There was no time to catch herself. Her body went backward. The back of her head struck the concrete edge of the pool on the way down. She was unconscious before she hit the ground. The kids were right there. The 8-year-old ran back toward the gate. The lifeguard, who was on duty inside the adjacent building during the closure, heard the commotion and came out within moments. Glenda was on her back on the deck, unresponsive, with visible trauma to the back of her head. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived and transported her to the nearest hospital, but the injury was severe. A direct impact to the back of the skull against a concrete edge doesn't leave a lot of room for recovery. Glenda was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause was listed as a fatal head injury resulting from a fall on a wet surface. The incident report confirmed that the closure sign had been posted on the gate before she entered. The staff member who warned her gave a statement corroborating that she had been told the area was not open. The hotel documented the event internally, but no structural changes were made to the pool area. The sign stayed, the tile stayed, the gate stayed unlocked, and that's the detail that I keep circling back to. Not the sign, not the warning, not even the wet tile. The gate, it was closed, but not locked. And I'm not saying that to shift blame because Glenda made her own choice to walk in. But I do wonder how different things would have been if that gate simply didn't open. Her kids were 6 and 8. They were standing a few feet away when their mom went down and didn't get back up. That's not something a sign on a gate prepares you for. And it's not something I think those kids will ever fully make sense of. A pool deck, a Sunday afternoon, and a shortcut past a warning that existed for exactly this reason. I think what makes Glenda's story stay with me is how small the window was. One step, one patch of wet tile, one angle of impact. Everything before that moment was fixable. Everything after it wasn't.
It was November 22nd, 2013, in New Haven, Connecticut. Cold rain coated the stone walkways outside a private university as donors arrived at a downtown hotel ballroom for an annual scholarship gala. Inside, technicians tested lighting cues, while staff arranged place settings beneath dim chandeliers. Security cameras covered the entrances and the raised stage, where a podium stood between 2 projection screens. Professor Malcolm Thorne, 58, had taught political science at the university for nearly 3 decades. He sat on admissions panels and influenced grant decisions that shaped academic careers. Some colleagues viewed him as a respected academic voice, while others questioned how much authority he held over students' futures. Over the previous year, several internal complaints accused him of misconduct toward graduate students. None resulted in criminal charges, and the university placed him under administrative review while allowing him to continue public appearances. including the gala. Among the attendees were 3 former students who had supported the complaints: David Bloom, 28, Paul Beckham, 27, and Dwayne Thomas, 29. Event staff later confirmed that earlier in the afternoon, Bloom and Beckham joined a routine walkthrough near the lighting control area. Maintenance logs noted a brief voltage fluctuation during testing, but technicians reset the system without reporting any further issue. Investigators would later determine that an emergency relay connected to the backup lighting had been manually disconnected during that period. By 8:40 p.m., dessert was cleared, and guests shifted their attention toward the stage. Cameras recorded Thorne approaching the podium as technicians dimmed the chandeliers. At 8:52 p.m., the ballroom lights went out. Later review confirmed the outage lasted 87 seconds, and the disabled relay prevented emergency lighting from activating. In the darkness, chairs scraped and guests began to stand, unsure whether the outage was part of the program or a technical fault. When the lights returned, Thorne lay beside the podium with his shirt soaked in blood across the chest and abdomen. A table near the stage was overturned as guests moved toward the exits in confusion. Investigators later determined that during the blackout, 3 individuals had converged near the podium before stepping back into the surrounding crowd and moving toward the exits. Emergency services were called immediately, and police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Paramedics found Thorne unresponsive with multiple stab wounds to the torso and upper legs. There were no defensive injuries on his hands. CPR was initiated as he was transported to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival despite emergency surgery. The medical examiner documented more than 20 sharp force injuries, several penetrating the abdomen and causing severe internal bleeding. One wound involved the femoral artery, contributing to rapid blood loss. The cause of death was ruled hypovolemic shock due to multiple stab wounds, and the manner of death was homicide. Investigators reviewed hotel security footage alongside a university recording of the speech area. The videos showed 3 figures moving toward the podium during the 87-second blackout before retreating into the crowd as the lights returned. Phone location data placed Bloom, Beckham, and Thomas within a few feet of Thorne at the time of the attack. Trace blood consistent with the victim was later identified on clothing recovered from Bloom and Beckham. Bloom and Beckham were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, and each received 45-year prison sentences. Thomas was convicted of conspiracy and received a 20-year sentence. Following the investigation, the university revised event security procedures and lighting system access protocols, and the case closed after sentencing. It was June 1st, 2018 in Tempe, Arizona. An off-campus rental sat behind trimmed oleanders and a sun-faded fence. Morning heat built early, and the house stayed closed to keep cool. In a back bedroom, a closet door met its frame cleanly. A heavy cylinder stood upright in shadow there. Before the morning plans, Chloe Ramirez, 21, was a design student and a part-time barista working early shifts. Print deadlines and cafe schedules were pinned above her desk. Her room stayed organized with sewing tools and lighting cords for small design projects. She often picked up extra shifts before rent was due. Group messages that evening showed timing notes, grocery splits, and a plan to set up balloons. A roommate had rented a large compressed nitrogen cylinder from a party supply vendor for balloon garlands earlier that evening. 5-foot steel tank arrived strapped to a hand truck with labels warning it should be secured upright and used only in ventilated areas. After several balloons were filled, the cylinder was rolled into Chloe's bedroom closet to keep it out of the living room. The anchor chain that normally secured the tank remained unused. The main valve had been turned most of the way closed, but not fully sealed, and the regulator remained attached. Before getting ready for bed, Chloe noticed the cylinder in the closet while gathering clothes. She briefly adjusted the closet door and looked at the tank before returning to her phone and setting her alarm. The house remained sealed for air conditioning with the bedroom window latched and the door closed. Chloe went to bed around 11:30 p.m. after friends left. The cylinder stood a few feet from the bed inside the closet, upright with the protective cap removed. A slow leak through the not fully closed valve allowed nitrogen to escape into the small room. A tight door sweep and a ceiling vent register kept air movement low. Nitrogen has no color or smell, so nothing in the room signaled that anything had changed. As the gas slowly leaked from the cylinder, the air inside the sealed bedroom began to shift. Chloe remained asleep while the oxygen in the room gradually dropped through the night. At some point during the night, she stopped responding. The bedding showed a sideways position with one arm under her head. There were no signs of struggle, toppled furniture, or forced entry. In the morning air later, her nail beds looked dusky and her lips gray-blue. A damp patch stained the sheet. Early stiffness at the jaw and elbows was noted by responders, consistent with several hours since death. A roommate knocked around 9 and found the bedroom door locked. They used a key and called 911 at 9:42 a.m. Tempe Fire arrived within 5 minutes. A 4-gas meter at the doorway showed oxygen around 16% before windows were opened, dropping lower near the closet where the cylinder stood. Body camera footage recorded the readings. Medics began an assessment but stopped when monitoring confirmed death. The cylinder valve was partially open. The coroner ruled environmental hypoxia from nitrogen displacement. There were no injuries. Toxicology tests were negative for alcohol and drugs, and the organs showed changes consistent with oxygen deprivation. Investigators photographed the room and documented the cylinder, regulator, and remaining pressure. The death was ruled an accident, and no criminal charges were filed. Officials later warned against storing compressed gas cylinders in living spaces, and a safety notice was circulated to students.
It was October 21st, 2019, at a Korean BBQ restaurant in a busy college neighborhood in Busan, South Korea. The evening rush was at full pace, every table occupied, the air thick with smoke and the smell of grilling meat. A group of friends had come in to celebrate finishing their exams. The mood was loud and relaxed, the kind of evening that feels like a reward after weeks of pressure. Ji-hoon Park, 22, was a second-year university student who had just finished his final exams earlier that day and joined his friends to unwind over dinner. As he arrived at the restaurant, his phone rang. His mother, calling to remind him to pick up her medication from a nearby clinic. He told her he would handle it later, asking her to be patient and assuring her he would stop by on his way home. When the group sat down, Ji-hoon took the seat closest to the tabletop grill. He took charge of the cooking the way some people naturally do in a group, picking up the tongs, turning the meat, leaning over the grill to check what was ready. His friends filmed casually on their phones, short clips of the food cooking, reactions, laughter. Ji-hoon was in most of the shots, and I want you to hold that image, because those clips his friends were recording are the footage that this case hinges on. They were filming a celebration. They did not know they were filming evidence. The table surface was crowded with plates and utensils, leaving little space around the grill. The grill was a butane-powered tabletop unit, the standard type used in Korean BBQ restaurants. A fuel canister sat beneath the cooking surface, connected to a burner with a manual flame control. The heat concentrated at table level and the setup was designed for close contact cooking. It was the same type of grill used at hundreds of restaurants across the country every night. Early in the meal, everything looked normal. The flame ran steadily, and the food cooked the way it was supposed to. Then, small things began to change. The flame flickered unevenly, surging briefly above its normal height before settling again. A faint hissing sound came from beneath the grill housing. One of Ji-hoon's friends heard it and mentioned it briefly. Nobody stopped cooking. Flame fluctuations were not unusual in busy service, and no one at the table treated it as anything more than a minor adjustment issue. The grill was adjusted slightly, and the conversation moved on. Ji-hoon kept turning the meat, leaning in and out of frame as his friends continued filming. This is the part that things began to go wrong. The hissing did not stop. The flame continued to flicker. Gas was escaping from a canister that had not fully locked into place, allowing it to leak at the connection point, heavier than the surrounding air. It began accumulating intermittently around the base of the grill, mixing with the surrounding air, but remaining concentrated enough near the burner housing to form an ignitable mixture. Staff were attending to multiple tables and did not approach before the ignition occurred. Over the following moments, the concentration became sufficient to ignite at the burner flame. Ji-hoon leaned forward to turn a piece of meat. The mixture ignited. The initial flash was instantaneous, but the flame did not immediately die. The continuing leak fed a sustained flare that persisted for several seconds, long enough to cause the injuries that followed. The fire rose directly into Ji-hoon's face as he leaned over the grill. The footage captured a sudden burst of light that overexposed the frame. Voices overlapped as people stood and moved away from the table. The camera dropped. During my research, I discovered that the last clear frame before the overexposure is Ji-hoon leaning forward with the tongs before the frame goes white. Restaurant staff responded immediately and emergency services were called. Ji-hoon was taken from the restaurant and transported to hospital, where he was admitted for treatment of severe burns to his face, neck, and upper body. The flare had risen directly into his airway as he leaned over the grill. An inhalation injury was confirmed alongside the external burns. Despite initial stabilization, the extent of the burns and inhalation injury led to severe complications over the following days. Ji-hoon Park died several days later. Footage reviewed by investigators showed flame instability and audible hissing just before ignition. Investigators concluded that gas had escaped from a canister that had not fully locked into place, accumulated in sufficient concentration near the burner housing, and ignited when the gas-air mixture reached its ignition threshold at the burner flame. He never got home to his mother. I can't help thinking that if he had gone to his mom when she called, he might still be alive.
It was October 14, 2016, in Asheville, North Carolina. The nights had turned cold, and the mountain roads were dark by early evening. Carla Voss, 34, had lived with Brett Holloway, 37, in a rented house on Caldwell Street for just over a year. The relationship had deteriorated steadily over the summer, and by early October, both of them knew it was finished. They were still living under the same roof while working out who would leave and when. The atmosphere in the house had become cold and largely silent. Brett had grown resentful as it became clear that Carla intended to be the one to stay and that he would be the one to go. In mid-October, Carla arranged to drive overnight to her aunt's home in Knoxville, Tennessee, approximately 3 hours away through the mountains. She mentioned the trip at home the evening before, telling Brett she was leaving Thursday after work and would be gone through the weekend. Brett said nothing. The car she planned to drive was a 2014 Toyota Camry registered in her name, with a factory-installed navigation system. The system stored a small number of saved destinations that could be selected from the main screen without entering an address. Carla had used the system on previous long trips and also to her aunt's house. One of the saved entries was labeled with her aunt's name. Brett was familiar with the car and its navigation system from the relationship. On the afternoon of October 14th, while Carla was at work, he sat in the car in the driveway and accessed the Saved Destinations menu. He deleted the saved entry and replaced it with a new saved location labeled with her aunt's name, directing the route toward an old forestry service road, approximately 40 minutes outside Asheville. The road had been closed to public use in 2011 following erosion damage along several sections. Although it still appeared in older navigation map data, it had not been maintained or inspected for years. That evening, Carla came home, changed, loaded a bag into the car, and left shortly after 8 p.m. Not knowing the mountain roads beyond the general highway route, she selected the saved destination from the navigation menu and followed the prompts. The system directed her south along the interstate before instructing her to exit onto a state road, then onto a series of progressively narrower roads leading into the forest. Because she had never driven through that part of the mountains, the route did not immediately seem wrong. The navigation continued to provide turn-by-turn instructions. She followed them. Approximately 45 minutes into the drive, the system directed her onto the old service road. Any old closure markers were difficult to see in the dark. She continued along the road as the pavement narrowed and the tree line closed in on both sides. Several hundred yards in, the road reached a section that had washed out in a landslide years earlier, leaving a steep drop into a ravine. By the time the washed-out section became visible in the headlights, there was not enough distance to stop. The vehicle went over the edge and into the ravine below. Carla's aunt reported her missing the following morning when she did not arrive and calls went to voicemail. Authorities located the crash site later that day after tracing her last known route. Carla Voss was found deceased inside the vehicle. Investigators recovered the navigation system and examined the saved destination used for the trip. The saved destination did not match any address associated with Carla's contacts or travel history. Technical analysis confirmed the entry had been manually input the afternoon of October 14th while Carla was at work. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Brett's vehicle in the driveway that afternoon. Brett Holloway was arrested 11 days later and charged with murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison.
It was May 2016, and the Utah desert was doing what it does best in late spring. baking everything under a sky so blue it almost looked fake. The kind of day where the heat comes off the sandstone in waves and the air smells like dust and dry brush. The state park overlook was busy with families, couples, and hikers making their way along the paved path that ran along the ridge. Becca Vant was 34 years old. She worked in retail, the kind of job where you spend most of your day managing other people's problems with a smile on your face. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily. She had opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. She was the type of person who would argue with a staff member over a posted policy, not out of cruelty, but because she genuinely believed rules were often made by people who didn't think things through. That personality followed her everywhere. That afternoon, she was at the park with her brother and her 2 kids, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. The overlook had a view that stretched out over a wide canyon, layers of red and orange rock dropping hundreds of feet below. It was genuinely stunning. The overlook had a waist-high metal railing along the edge, installed after previous incidents at the same location. Multiple posted signs warned about loose rock and unstable ground beyond the barrier. A park ranger had already told the crowd directly to stay behind the railing because the ground past it was not stable. Becca heard all of that, but like most rules she didn't agree with, she didn't treat it as something that actually applied to her. At some point during their visit, a bighorn sheep appeared on the slope just beyond the barrier, probably only 30 or 40 feet away. People around her were pointing and pulling out their phones. Becca wanted a better shot. The railing, from her perspective, was in the way. She stepped past it. She moved about 8 to 10 feet beyond the barrier onto open sandstone. The surface looked solid from a distance, but loose gravel sat on top of slanted sections of stone near the overlook edge. She held her phone up and began backing toward the drop, trying to frame the shot. What happened next was pieced together from witness accounts. Her heel caught a patch of loose gravel on a slanted section of rock. She didn't trip dramatically. She just lost her footing. The kind of quiet, sudden shift that doesn't give you time to react. Her balance went, and she went with it. She fell down a steep, rocky incline, dropping approximately 35 to 40 feet before striking the side of her head on exposed stone. Witnesses at the railing saw it happen. Her brother was among them. Park medics reached her within several minutes. There was no pulse when they arrived. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was blunt force head trauma. Witness statements confirmed she had been warned, and the ranger's address to the crowd was documented in the report. What I keep coming back to isn't the fall itself. It's how many layers of warning were already in place. A permanent barrier, multiple signs, a ranger who spoke directly to the crowd, and still, the view felt more important than the boundary. I don't say that to be harsh. I think most of us have pushed past something we probably shouldn't have. The difference is that most of us don't pay for it the way Becca did. Her 2 kids were standing at that railing when it happened. That detail alone is something I haven't been able to shake. The official report concluded the ground was unstable. Warnings had been clearly posted and verbally communicated, and the fall was consistent with terrain conditions at that section of the overlook. No foul play, no equipment failure, just a decision made in a few seconds that couldn't be undone. And for me, Becca's case keeps circling back to one thought. She saw the barrier, she heard the ranger, and she decided none of it applied to her. And that's what makes it stick, because it wasn't reckless in the way we usually picture reckless. It was just confidence in the wrong moment.
It was October 18, 2016. In a quiet subdivision in Columbus, Ohio, delivery trucks moved past brick ranch homes as late afternoon light settled over narrow driveways and front porches. By mid-afternoon, a large cardboard box sat unopened on one porch in a neighborhood where packages had repeatedly gone missing. Across the street lived Helen Gable, 52, alone in a single-story house facing that porch. She had spent most of her adult life in warehouse retail, unloading freight and sorting returns. After a recent layoff, she struggled to keep up with utilities and property taxes. Over the previous 2 years, neighbors reported missing deliveries. Doorbell cameras showed Helen carrying parcels into her home. She had twice been cited for misdemeanor theft, paid fines, and remained in the neighborhood. Directly opposite her lived Darren Cole, 44, a machinist at a metal fabrication shop outside the city. He frequently ordered specialty tools online and had filed 3 police reports for stolen packages within the prior year. Surveillance clips attached to those reports showed Helen crossing the street shortly after deliveries arrived. Investigators documented a pattern connected to Darren's address. That Tuesday at 2:40 p.m., A box labeled espresso machine was scanned and left on Darren's porch. Shipping records listed the weight at just under 40 pounds. Video later reviewed showed Helen standing near her front window before stepping outside at 3:06 p.m. She crossed the street, lifted the box with visible effort, and carried it into her kitchen. The package remained on her table for several minutes. A neighbor's security camera recorded her separating the top flaps at 3:16 p.m. Another camera across the street captured her leaning over the box. Investigators confirmed the incident was recorded from two angles. At 3:17 p.m., residents heard a sharp metallic pop followed by a loud hiss and a scream. Vapor drifted from her kitchen window. Emergency services were called immediately, and police and fire units were dispatched. Inside the home, responders found evidence of a sudden pressurized release. The cardboard box had burst along its seams. A metal cylinder lay ruptured near the table. Cabinets and walls were coated with a dark liquid that had stripped paint and marked laminate surfaces. Helen was on the floor near the stove. Her clothing across the chest and shoulders was heavily damaged, and exposed skin showed extensive chemical injury. Paramedics arrived in about 6 minutes. The kitchen air remained thick with fumes. Helen had severe burns to her face, neck, and upper torso. Her airway was markedly swollen, and her breathing became increasingly difficult before she lost consciousness during transport to a nearby hospital. She was pronounced dead at 3:46 p.m. Investigators later determined the package contained a pressurized container filled with a corrosive drain cleaning solution. When the box was opened, pressure inside the container released the contents upward at close range, creating both liquid exposure and irritating vapor. Laboratory testing confirmed a concentrated sulfuric-based cleaner. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death to be severe chemical burns with inhalation injury. The manner of death was homicide. 2 days later, detectives searched Darren Cole's home and found online searches related to retaliation for package theft, along with receipts for industrial fittings and a pressurized container consistent with fragments recovered from the scene. He was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years plus 8 additional years for weapons charges. The case was cited locally as a revenge killing linked to repeated theft. Neighborhood watch programs expanded, and police issued public advisories warning residents against setting retaliatory traps. It was January 27, 2015 in Pennsylvania. Winter had settled across the college town. Most dormitory windows were dark by midnight as students prepared for early classes. Inside a mid-1960s brick residence hall, dozens of students slept while steel bunk frames occasionally creaked as heating pipes expanded in the cold. Living in that dormitory was Daniel Shu, 19. He was a first-year engineering student who had moved from New Jersey the previous fall. His parents ran a small restaurant, and Daniel had always preferred repairing electronics over working the counter. In high school, he built small robots and entered regional science competitions. Teachers described him as careful and focused. College life was still new to him. Daniel spent most evenings studying in the common lounge before returning to the shared dorm room he occupied with 2 other engineering students. The room was small and crowded, typical of older residence halls built decades earlier. A freestanding steel bunk bed rated for 2 occupants stood against one wall. Daniel slept in the lower bunk beneath the upper frame where his roommate normally slept. Earlier that winter, several students on the floor had complained that the bunk beds rattled whenever someone climbed to the top. Maintenance staff checked a few frames and tightened loose bolts, a common repair for modular dorm furniture that is repeatedly assembled and disassembled each semester. The steel frames in that building had been moved and reassembled many times over the years. That night, Daniel stayed up late preparing for a calculus quiz scheduled the next morning. Around midnight, he returned to the dorm room, while his roommate remained in the library finishing a group project. Daniel climbed into the lower bunk and fell asleep after a long day of classes. Sometime after 2 a.m., a sudden metallic crack echoed inside the dorm room. At approximately 2:07 a.m., according to hallway security camera timestamps, the upper bunk frame above Daniel shifted violently and dropped from roughly 5 feet above the lower mattress. The metal platform twisted as it fell, collapsing directly onto the lower bed where Daniel slept. As the frame struck, one welded steel guard rail fractured at the joint. A broken section of steel tubing punched downward through the mattress and bedding. Students in nearby rooms later told investigators they heard a loud crash, followed by the sound of metal striking the floor. One student across the hall opened his door and saw the dorm room door partly open and a desk lamp shaking on the desk inside. Inside the room, the upper bunk had collapsed onto the lower frame. The broken steel rail had driven through the mattress, striking Daniel in the upper chest, while the rest of the frame pinned his torso against the lower bed structure. Emergency services were called at 2:12 a.m. after a resident assistant reported the collapse. Officers and paramedics arrived about 7 minutes later. By the time they reached the room, Daniel showed no signs of breathing or movement. Investigators photographed the twisted bunk frame resting across the lower bed, with the broken rail lodged through the mattress at the impact point. The coroner ruled the death blunt and penetrating chest trauma from the collapsing frame. The autopsy found severe heart and chest injuries consistent with a heavy metal object driven downward, findings consistent with Daniel having been asleep at the time of the collapse. Investigators later found several bunk frames with worn bolts and weakened brackets. The death was ruled an accident. Maintenance crews removed the bunk beds from the dorm floor for inspection, and the university later replaced them with reinforced single beds. It was July 22, 2016, in Death Valley National Park, California. Heat climbed toward noon under a cloudless sky. Pale desert gravel stretched around a roadside turnout. A dark sealed tent stood alone, unmoving in the still air. Park advisories that morning warned visitors about extreme temperatures and rapid dehydration risk. Derek Shaw, 34, worked in IT support in Las Vegas and spent weekends running a small online channel reviewing camping gear. His videos followed a simple format with short field tests rather than travel vlogs. The audience was small but steady. He had recently purchased an Arctic blackout tent designed for cold climates. The fabric was heavy, dark, and insulated to trap warmth and block outside light. Derek wanted to test how well it kept sunlight out during a desert morning. His plan was to record the interior darkness and monitor temperature changes. During a regional heat wave, he drove to Death Valley for the test. Park bulletins warned of dangerous heat across the valley floor, where shade was scarce and temperatures rose quickly after sunrise. Derek planned to arrive early, set up the tent before direct sunlight, and document conditions through the morning as the desert warmed. He reached a gravel turnout shortly before sunrise and chose level ground away from brush. At 6:10 a.m., he staked the corners and pulled the rainfly tight across the frame. The windows and roof vents were zipped shut to block outside light. The temperature at sunrise in Furnace Creek that morning was already near 90 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6:30 a.m., he crawled inside to test the interior darkness. The tent walls hung close beneath the outer fly. With every vent closed, the space was quiet and sealed. The thick, insulated fabric blocked most outside light. He settled down inside the tent as part of a rest test. As the morning progressed, the sun climbed over the surrounding ridges and struck the valley floor directly. By 8:45 a.m., the tent sat in full sunlight. The dark outer shell absorbed heat and radiated it inward. With no airflow through the sealed vents, warm air collected under the liner and remained trapped inside the enclosed space. Around 9:12 a.m., the rising heat inside the tent created conditions consistent with severe heat stress. The sealed interior continued heating as the sun climbed higher. Later measurements by park rangers showed the air inside the sealed tent may have exceeded 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Another camper passed the turnout later that morning and noticed the parked car and the tent sitting unchanged under direct sun. After calling out and receiving no reply, emergency services were contacted from the main road. Rangers arrived shortly afterward and opened the tent. Derek was found inside, unresponsive. Medical crews attempted resuscitation and cooling measures before transporting him from the site. The county coroner later ruled the cause of death as hyperthermia caused by environmental heat. The examination described classic heat stroke findings, including severe dehydration, a body temperature estimated above 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and neurological damage caused by extreme heat exposure. Park rangers documented the scene and collected the camping equipment for the report. The tent remained fully zipped and positioned in direct sun on the open valley floor. Weather records from that morning showed rapidly rising temperatures across Death Valley, confirming the extreme heat conditions present during the test.
It was June 8, 2021 near Birmingham, England. The morning was mild and the streets around the shopping stretch were already busy with foot traffic and slow-moving vehicles. Small shops had their doors open and people were moving between them along both sides of the road. 61-year-old Margaret Ellis had recently retired after decades working as an administrative assistant for a local council. She had spent the better part of 30 years in the same building, the same desk, the same route to work. Retirement had come quietly, marked by a small gathering in the office and a card signed by people she had worked alongside for most of her adult life. That morning, she had packed a small bag with items for her daughter, who had given birth 2 days earlier. There was a set of soft clothing, a few things she had picked out herself, and a card she had written the night before and read back twice before sealing. "Let's just pause for a while." She read the card back twice before sealing it. I could imagine how she was so happy doing that. She reached a marked pedestrian crossing on the main road and stopped at the curb. The signal was red for traffic. She waited. The pedestrian light changed to green. The vehicles in the nearest lane slowed and stopped. In the adjacent lane, one driver braked a moment later than the others, stopping slightly past the line before settling. Margaret shifted her bag to her other hand and stepped off the curb, moving toward the opposite pavement at a normal walking pace. And this is the part where the CCTV footage becomes the whole story. In the background of the footage, one vehicle continues moving while the others have already stopped. She reached the midpoint of the crossing. The vehicle continued to approach. It was partially obscured by the flow of traffic and the roadside structures lining the stretch. The traffic light had been red long enough for pedestrians to be fully committed to the crossing. The driver did not slow down. The vehicle entered the intersection at speed against the red light and struck Margaret while she was in the middle of the crossing. She had no time to react. The impact threw her onto the road surface. The vehicle did not stop immediately. It continued forward before coming to a halt further along the road, leaving a gap between the point of impact and where it finally stopped. Margaret lay on the crossing. The traffic in both directions had come to a standstill. A shop worker standing near the doorway of a nearby store witnessed the collision. He called emergency services. Other people nearby stopped. The street, which had been moving normally seconds before, went still. A CCTV camera mounted above a storefront across the road had been recording the crossing throughout. The footage captured the full sequence clearly. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Margaret Ellis was treated at the scene and transported to hospital. She died from her injuries shortly after arrival. She had been on her way to see her daughter's newborn child. The bag she had packed that morning was recovered at the scene. Authorities reviewed the CCTV footage and confirmed that Margaret had been crossing with the pedestrian signal in her favor and that the driver had failed to stop at a red light. The driver was identified, arrested, and charged in connection with the incident. The card she had written the night before was still inside the bag, sealed.
It was September 3rd, 2015, outside Lexington, Kentucky. Late summer heat still lingered across the rolling pasture land, and the narrow county roads were quiet after sunset. Gerald Marsh, 58, lived alone in a small ranch-style house on a 15-acre property his family had owned for decades outside Lexington, Kentucky. Years earlier, the land had been used to keep several horses, with a small training barn that Gerald and his father had built together. Even after the animals were gone, the pastures and fencing remained, and nearby horse farms had begun showing interest in the land. Gerald had spent most of his life working at a sheet metal plant before severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease forced him to stop. By 2014, the illness had progressed to the point that he could not maintain safe oxygen levels while sleeping, and doctors prescribed nightly oxygen therapy. A concentrator sat beside his bed each night, feeding oxygen through clear tubing connected to a nasal cannula he wore while he slept. The machine's front panel displayed the flow setting as a small floating ball inside a clear tube. Gerald's prescription required 2 liters of oxygen per minute. Without it, doctors said his oxygen saturation would gradually fall during the night. Gerald had one brother, Dennis Marsh, 61, who lived about 40 minutes away. When their father died in 2014, the farmland was left without a will specifying ownership. Dennis wanted to sell the property to a neighboring horse farm, looking to expand its pasture land. Gerald refused, arguing the land should stay in the family. The disagreement quickly turned bitter, with lawyers becoming involved and communication nearly stopping altogether. Relatives later said the dispute had reached a point many families recognize, when shared land becomes less about property and more about who refuses to give in. On the evening of September 3rd, Dennis arrived at Gerald's house shortly after 6 p.m. He told his brother he needed to collect several old horse tack boxes their father had stored in the garage. Gerald allowed him inside. They spoke briefly in the kitchen before Dennis moved down the hallway toward the back of the house. For several minutes, he was alone near the bedroom. Before leaving, Dennis stepped into the room and quietly adjusted the oxygen concentrator. He reached down and turned the flow meter knob until the floating indicator ball dropped far below Gerald's prescribed 2-liter setting. The machine continued running normally, its compressor humming and indicator light glowing, and from across the room nothing appeared unusual. Dennis left shortly before 7 p.m. Gerald locked the house, fed his dog, and went to bed later that night at his usual time. He placed the nasal cannula in position and turned off the bedside lamp as the concentrator continued running beside him. Because Gerald's disease was in its final stage, he could not maintain safe oxygen levels without the device operating correctly. Through the night, his blood oxygen gradually declined. The reduction was slow and silent. Gerald never woke. The following morning, a neighbor called 911 after Gerald's dog barked continuously for more than an hour. Emergency responders arrived and found Gerald unresponsive in bed. The nasal cannula remained in place and the oxygen concentrator was still running. While checking the equipment, one of the paramedics noticed the flow meter was set far below the level marked on the prescription label. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and Gerald Marsh was pronounced dead at the scene. During the medical examination, technicians confirmed the concentrator had been set far below the prescribed oxygen level and that the machine had no mechanical fault. Investigators later learned that Dennis Marsh had visited the house the previous evening. When questioned by detectives, Dennis admitted he had lowered the oxygen setting during the visit. The death was ruled a homicide, and Dennis Marsh was arrested and charged with murder. He later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. It was June 18, 2015. The forest along Washington's Olympic Peninsula was damp from morning rain, and a gravel road leading to a small cluster of rental cabins showed tire tracks slowly filling with water. By dusk, one porch light remained on against the fir trees, the quiet settling in early. 3 months earlier, Dr. Maya Tan, 41, had begun communicating online with a man using an alias and altered photos. Maya was a general surgeon in Tacoma, spending long hours in operating rooms where controlling bleeding and timing each step can determine survival. She specialized in abdominal surgery and was known for steady hands and careful planning. The year before, her younger sister Claire died by suicide after losing more than $60,000 in a romance scam, later linked to Elias Vaughn, 38. Court records later showed that Vaughn of Boise, Idaho, had faced several civil complaints accusing him of financial deception through online relationships. He had no prior criminal convictions. Phone data confirmed that Maya and Vaughn exchanged messages for weeks before arranging a weekend stay at a remote glamping cabin outside Port Angeles, about 12 miles from the nearest paved road with limited cell service. Weather advisories that week warned of steady rain and possible service interruptions. The rental agreement noted the isolation. On June 18th, a gas station camera in Port Angeles recorded Vaughn fueling a rented SUV at 2:12 p.m. A separate roadside camera captured Maya's vehicle on the same highway shortly after. Digital gate logs showed both vehicles entering the property before 4 p.m. A phone placed on the kitchen counter recorded short video clips earlier that evening, showing them unpacking and drinking. A second phone later captured partial video and audio before shutting off, according to forensic review of the devices. Investigators confirmed the events were recorded twice, once before the violence and once during the attack, though the second recording ended abruptly. By nightfall, outgoing calls from both phones had stopped. Toxicology later showed Vaughn had ingested a prescription sedative found in his bloodstream at a level consistent with slowed reactions and impaired movement. Medication packaging was recovered from a trash bin, the bed had been stripped, and investigators documented plastic sheeting beneath the mattress. A compact medical kit was found in the cabin, cleaned but with visible staining inside its hinges. The autopsy documented multiple incisions to the lower abdomen and upper thigh consistent with someone familiar with basic anatomical landmarks. The fatal injury involved the left femoral artery, a major blood vessel in the upper leg. Investigators noted that damage to this vessel can lead to rapid blood loss within minutes. Toxicology confirmed a sedative level high enough to limit coordinated movement without causing full unconsciousness. Blood pooled beneath his body in a pattern consistent with him lying on his back for several minutes, and investigators estimated fatal blood loss occurred within 10 to 15 minutes. Faint heel marks suggested limited movement before collapse. The property manager discovered the body 3 days later and contacted emergency services. The death was ruled homicide due to exsanguination from sharp force trauma. Phone records, gate entry logs, and recovered video files placed Dr. Maya Tan at the cabin during the final hours before Vaughn's death, leading to her arrest. She was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole.
It was March 4th, 2018, a cool early spring evening in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where most of the restaurants close by 9 and everyone knows which diner has the best pie. This particular spot was a little family-run place off a 2-lane road. Nothing fancy. Checkered tablecloths, a handwritten specials board, maybe 15 tables total, the kind of diner where the staff remembers your order if you come in twice. Paula Dwan was 45 years old. She worked as a cashier at a shop in town and was the type of mother who turned small outings into events. Dinner at the diner wasn't just dinner. It was her and her teenage daughter catching up, talking about school, picking apart the menu like it was a 5-star restaurant. That evening, the two of them sat down for what was supposed to be exactly that, a normal weeknight meal. Now here's where I need you to pay attention, because what happened next wasn't sudden, it was slow, and every step of it was avoidable. Paula had a peanut allergy. She knew about it. She'd had it for years. When she sat down, she mentioned it to the server, but according to staff statements taken afterward, she downplayed it. She told them small amounts were usually fine. The server flagged it anyway and let her know the dessert she was looking at contained ground peanuts. Not traces, ground peanuts, baked directly into it. The staff offered to bring her something else. Paula declined. She insisted it would be fine, and she wasn't carrying any allergy medication with her. No emergency kit, no backup plan, just confidence that it had never been that bad before, so it probably wouldn't be that bad now. She ate the dessert. Several minutes later, still seated at the table with her daughter, she started coughing. A persistent, dry one, the kind you try to clear with a sip of water. Then the redness started showing, around her face first, then spreading down her neck. Her daughter noticed. The staff noticed. Breathing became visibly harder, that tight, labored sound that tells you the airway is narrowing. The staff offered to call emergency services right away, and this is the part that's hardest for me to sit with. Paula hesitated. She delayed the call. Maybe she thought it would pass. Maybe she didn't want to make a scene in front of her daughter. But those minutes mattered, and they were spent waiting instead of acting. By the time the situation became undeniable, she collapsed near the table. Her body had moved into full anaphylactic shock, and without medication to slow it down, there was nothing anyone in that diner could do. The ambulance arrived roughly 6 minutes after the call was finally made. Paula was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause was listed as a severe allergic reaction, anaphylaxis triggered by a known allergen she had been explicitly warned about in a food she chose to eat, without carrying the one thing that might have bought her enough time. The health inspection that followed found no violations. The staff had identified the allergen, communicated it clearly, and offered an alternative. Every box was checked on their end. And honestly, that's the detail that sits with me the heaviest, is that everyone in that diner did exactly what they were supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough to save her from herself. And I think that's what makes Paula's story land differently. There was no reckless driver, no unstable ground. There was a woman who knew she had an allergy, heard the warning out loud from someone standing right in front of her, and decided it didn't apply this time. And her daughter was sitting across the table for all of it. I keep coming back to the delay, not the dessert, not even the missing medication. The moment where help was offered and the answer was not yet. That gap, those few minutes between the first cough and the 911 call, that's where the outcome was probably decided.
It was April 16th, 2017. In a busy nightlife district, the clubs were active, music carrying through open doors and out onto the street, groups of people moving between venues. The air outside smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled drinks, and the pavement stayed crowded well past midnight. Emily Carter, 23, worked the early shift at a coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment, the kind of place where the regulars knew her order before she did. She had recently come out of a long relationship, the kind of ending ending that does not settle quickly, and her friend had pushed for the night out as a way to get some distance from it. Emily had agreed. Before they left, she posted a short video to her story. Her friend pulling her toward the door, Emily laughing and covering the camera. It was the last thing she posted. For 1 second, I want you to hold that clip in your mind for this entire story. Her friend pulling her toward the door, Emily laughing. That is where this night starts on camera. They filmed throughout the evening the way people do in that kind of setting. Short clips, dancing, drinks, laughter, moments caught between songs. The phone was often pointed at Emily. The early footage shows her present but slightly withdrawn, smiling in places but quieter than her friend, who carried most of the energy between them. As the night went on, Emily began to relax. Her expressions became more natural, and she started to engage more with the moment. Her friend captured a clip of her laughing and sent it to Emily's sister, saying she was doing better. Throughout the footage, they remained together, moving through familiar parts of the venue. Later in the night, a man began appearing in the background of the clips, standing near the bar area and moving between groups. It was not immediately noticeable. He was further back in the frame at first, then closer. Then he was speaking with them. He had entered the interaction gradually enough that there was no single moment where it happened. He was simply there, and then he had been there long enough that it no longer seemed unusual. Emily's friend appeared relaxed around him, continuing to film and respond to him casually. Emily was visible in the clips, present but quieter than she had been earlier in the night. And this is the part of the footage that I find most unsettling to read about. Not because anything dramatic is happening, because nothing is. He is just there, gradually, and then completely. The final clips were recorded outside the venue sometime after midnight. The crowd noise dropped slightly away from the entrance, and the lighting was harder, less diffused than inside. The man was fully present with them by this point. He offered to take them home. Emily's friend responded first. Emily was visible in the frame. She hesitated. The shift in her expression lasted only a moment, but it was clear on camera. A brief pause, her eyes moving toward her friend before she answered. Her friend's tone was casual. There was no visible concern in how she spoke. The man remained calm and stayed where he was. The decision was made quickly after that. The last clip shows them walking toward a dark-colored sedan, parked slightly away from the main entrance. The doors open. Emily gets in. The recording ends. Authorities reviewed footage from the venue's camera system, street cameras, and recordings recovered from Emily's phone. The timeline was consistent across all sources. The final recorded moment placing Emily was her entering the vehicle. Investigators later identified the man seen in the footage and connected him to her disappearance. Emily Carter, 23, was never seen again after that night. Her case remains unresolved. All of it, from her friend pulling her toward the door at the start of the evening to the car door closing at the end. I watched it, and somewhere in that sequence is every decision that led to the last frame. A door closing, and then nothing.
It was May 14th, 2016, in a coastal barangay outside Calbayog City, Samar, Philippines. The afternoon heat had settled over the cluster of houses near the shoreline. Roosters scratched in dusty yards while most people rested indoors. In one yard, a wooden swing hung from ropes tied to a coconut tree. Living in the house was Arturo Salazar, 47. He worked as a motorcycle mechanic at a small roadside repair stall along the provincial highway. Most of his work involved fixing punctured tires, adjusting carburetors, and replacing worn chains on tricycles and fishing motorcycles used in nearby villages. Customers trusted him because he rarely rushed repairs. Arturo lived with his wife and 2 teenage sons in a small wooden house raised slightly on concrete posts. The yard was shaded by several tall coconut palms planted decades earlier by his father. Like many homes in the area, a simple swing had been tied beneath one of the trees where family members rested during the hottest part of the afternoon. That morning had been busy at the repair stall. Several fishermen arrived with engine trouble before noon, and Arturo spent hours working in the sun beside the road. By early afternoon, he closed the shop and returned home for lunch. After eating rice, dried fish, and vegetables with his family, he stepped outside while the others stayed indoors to escape the heat. The swing hung beneath one of the taller coconut palms. The ropes were tied high around the trunk, holding a wooden board seat worn smooth from years of use. Arturo sat down and leaned back slightly, letting the swing move slowly in the light breeze. Afternoon naps outside were common in the barangay. Several neighbors later remembered seeing him resting there shortly after 2 o'clock. Above him, the coconut tree stood nearly 60 feet tall. Mature coconuts hung in clusters near the crown of the palm. Farmers usually harvested them regularly, but some fruit fell naturally when the stems dried and weakened. Sometime during the early afternoon, one of those stems finally snapped. The coconut dropped from the crown of the tree, falling roughly 50 feet through the fronds. Weighing about 4 pounds, it reached high speed before striking Arturo directly on the top of the head as he slept on the swing. Neighbors later said they heard a dull thud, but assumed a coconut had simply fallen into the yard. The swing moved gently back and forth beneath the tree, while Arturo remained seated with his head slumped forward. It was not discovered until around 4:30 p.m., when his wife stepped outside to call him in for coffee. She saw the coconut near the swing and realized he was not moving. Local health workers were called immediately, followed by police from Calbayog City. A local physician later determined the cause of death was severe blunt force trauma to the head, documenting a depressed skull fracture and brain injury, consistent with impact from a heavy object falling from height. Investigators noted no signs of struggle, indicating Arturo had been asleep on the swing at the moment of impact. Afterward, neighbors cut down several coconuts from the same tree to prevent further accidents. It was September 3, 2015. Late summer crowds moved through Yosemite National Park under clear skies. Water from a recent melt ran down the granite slopes above a deep plunge pool. From a distance, the pale rock looked harmless, like a broad sloping slab carrying a thin sheet of water toward the pool below. Earlier that afternoon, Jake Callahan, 22, arrived with 3 college friends. He studied business and worked part-time at a sporting goods store to help cover tuition. Friends described him as energetic and competitive, usually the first to try anything physical or risky. Jake had grown up hiking in the Sierra foothills with his family. Yosemite was familiar, though mostly from marked trails and overlooks. The Labor Day weekend trip was meant to be simple camping before the semester resumed. That afternoon, the group wandered away from the main trail toward a runoff channel above a plunge pool. Thin sheets of snowmelt slid over a long stretch of granite that looked smooth from above. Warning signs posted near the trailhead advised visitors not to slide on granite near waterfalls because of severe injury risk. Rangers regularly documented serious friction burns, broken bones, and fatal falls from people attempting similar stunts. Those signs stood several hundred yards away along the marked path. Jake and his friends had already moved off the trail by the time they reached the slope. Jake climbed to the top, while the others remained near the pool below. Several hikers nearby paused along the rocks and watched as he moved into position. The water covering the granite formed a shallow layer reflecting the afternoon light. The slope looked slick and uninterrupted, with no visible ledges or rough breaks along the surface. He sat at the top edge and pushed himself forward with both hands. At first, the movement was slow. The thin flow of water carried him downward gradually, like the start of a slide. Within seconds, the slope steepened, and his speed increased sharply. Witnesses later described him accelerating much faster than expected. About halfway down, the thin sheet of water broke apart beneath him. His back and hips made direct contact with the granite. The glacially polished granite was extremely rough at high speed, acting like abrasive stone against the skin. When a body moves quickly across it, those crystals behave like coarse abrasive grit. Hikers below later described hearing a harsh scraping sound, echoing across the rock walls as he slid past them. His swim trunks tore almost immediately. The rough granite caused severe friction burns and abrasions across his back and legs as he continued sliding down the slope. By the time he reached the plunge pool, he entered the water at high speed and struck the surface hard on his back. The impact stunned him, and he briefly drifted before slipping beneath the surface. His friends rushed toward the pool and pulled him out moments later. Emergency services were called immediately. Visitors nearby tried to keep him conscious while waiting for help. Park medics reached the pool about 14 minutes later and began emergency treatment before preparing him for evacuation. Jake was unconscious and breathing weakly when rescuers placed him on a stretcher. He had severe abrasions across his back and legs, along with signs of head and spinal trauma from the impact with the water. He went into cardiac arrest during evacuation before the rescue helicopter reached the hospital. The county coroner ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma, with drowning after a high-speed slide down wet granite into the plunge pool. It was February 12, 2018. Offices along North Stemmons Freeway in Dallas moved through a routine Monday under fluorescent lights and steady keyboard noise. The carpeted hallway and small break room looked ordinary. Nothing suggested that a routine lunch break would end in a catastrophic equipment failure that would turn fatal. Gary Holt, 46, had worked at the logistics firm for 11 years, rising from dispatcher to middle manager overseeing delivery schedules and warehouse staffing. Co-workers described him as efficient but often dismissive of minor rules. Human Resources records documented repeated complaints that he took clearly labeled lunches from the shared refrigerator, including several belonging to Daniel Kim, 29. Gary denied the accusations and treated them as minor office disputes. Daniel was a junior logistics analyst with no criminal record. He managed routing software and shipment data, and often stayed late during peak periods. To save money while paying student loans, he brought homemade meals daily and labeled them clearly. The break room microwave sat on a laminated counter near a sink and vending machine, plugged into a standard 120-volt outlet. It was a commercial-grade unit, with a steel interior and rotating glass tray. By noon that Monday, several staff members were out, leaving the break room nearly empty. The refrigerator held only a few containers, spaced along the top shelf. Security cameras mounted near the ceiling recorded both the entrance and interior as Gary stepped inside at 12:18 p.m. He removed a foil-wrapped burrito from a paper bag labeled with Daniel's name, placed it in the microwave, closed the door, and set the timer. The machine hummed as the glass tray began to rotate and the interior light flickered on. Seconds later, faint electrical arcing flickered against the steel interior walls. The heating continued as pressure and gas built within the food container. At 12:20 p.m., a sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a sudden rupture. The microwave door forced open and struck the opposite wall while dense smoke and debris pushed outward into the break room. The interior camera captured a brief flash consistent with electrical arcing before the space filled with dark smoke. Gary stepped back, his clothing darkened by heat and residue as he tried to move away from the counter. He staggered toward the sink and collapsed, severe thermal burns visible across his face and upper chest. Employees in nearby offices reported the smell of burning and saw smoke drifting into the hallway as emergency services were called and the building evacuation began. Responders arrived within minutes and found Gary unresponsive on the floor. Burn patterns later indicated he had been standing directly in front of the microwave when it failed. He went into cardiac arrest during transport and was pronounced dead at 12:48 p.m. The medical examiner documented fatal thermal injuries and significant inhalation damage from superheated smoke and gases. The cause of death was ruled homicide, resulting from injuries associated with a modified lithium-ion battery device concealed in food. Investigators recovered damaged battery cells, wiring, and foil fragments from the microwave cavity. Purchase records showed Daniel Kim had ordered battery components weeks earlier, and his computer history included searches related to battery overheating in enclosed environments. He was arrested 3 days later, charged with first-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years.
It was July 20th, 2017, a hot Thursday afternoon in Missouri, the kind of summer day where the air sits heavy and the water is the only place anyone wants to be. The lake was a popular recreational spot, big enough for motorboats, pontoons, and the occasional jet ski cutting lines across the surface. By mid-afternoon, the water had decent traffic, wakes crossing over each other, engines humming in the distance, families anchored in coves with coolers and music. Rhoda Krell was 36 years old. She worked at a salon in town and was the kind of person who had to be in charge of everything. If there was a group outing, she picked the date, picked the location, and then found something wrong with all of it once they got there. That afternoon was one of hers. She'd gotten 3 friends together for a day on the water. They rented a motorboat from a small marina along the shore. A standard open bow rental, maybe 18 or 19 feet, enough room for 4 people and a cooler. Before they even got the keys, Rhoda told the rental operator the boat looked old and she wanted a different one. He explained it was the only one available. She asked to speak to a manager, then threatened to leave a review that would shut the place down. Her friends stood on the dock pretending to check their phones. When they boarded, the operator went through the basics. Life jackets were provided for every passenger. He strongly recommended wearing them at all times. Rhoda's friends put theirs on or kept them within reach. Rhoda picked hers up, told the operator it was dirty, and tossed it back under the seat. She told him she'd been on boats her whole life and didn't need someone at a rental dock telling her what to do. He asked her one more time to stay seated while moving and to wear the jacket. She waved him off. "I'm not telling you this to ridicule her. I'm telling you this because every piece of what happened next connects directly back to this moment. The jacket was right there. The warning had been given multiple times, and she didn't just decline it, she turned it into a confrontation she needed to win." They headed out onto the lake. One of the friends was driving, keeping a reasonable speed. Rhoda was standing near the side of the boat, not braced against anything. One friend asked her to sit down. Rhoda told her to stop worrying. Another brought up what the operator had said. Rhoda told her the operator didn't know what he was talking about. Then another boat passed, moving fast enough to throw a large wake across their path. Rolling waves, maybe 2 or 3 feet high, hitting them broadside. The bow lifted suddenly, not violent by boating standards, but abrupt, and Rhoda was standing. Her weight shifted. She lost her balance and went sideways over the rail. Not a dramatic launch, a stumble that the low rail couldn't stop. She hit the water near the side of the boat. Her friends expected her to surface immediately. A few seconds passed, then a few more. She didn't come up. The driver cut the engine. One of the friends jumped in and pulled her back onto the boat within seconds, but she was already unresponsive. Without a life jacket to keep her head above the surface, those few seconds underwater were all it took. Her friends started CPR right away. A rescue team reached them within minutes, but Rhoda never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead on the water. The official cause was listed as drowning following an accidental fall overboard. The operator was not cited. Passengers had been warned. Life jackets had been provided. Every safety measure had been offered, explained, and rejected. And that's the part that sits with me. The jacket was on the boat within arm's reach. The warning had been given over and over, and every single time she treated it like an insult, like the rules existed for other people. It was just a wake, a stumble, and a missing vest. 3 things that lined up in the worst possible order on an otherwise perfect afternoon. Her friends were right there. They got her out in seconds, and it still wasn't enough. A life jacket would have held her face above water for every single one of those seconds. I keep imagining being one of those friends, the ones who asked her to sit down, who reminded her about the jacket, who did everything right, and still having to carry that.
It was September 3rd, 2015 in Naperville, Illinois. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet street where most residents had lived for years and kept largely to themselves. Carol Simmons, 57, had lived alone since her daughter moved to Minneapolis earlier that spring. She had been diagnosed with epilepsy in her mid-40s and managed the condition with medication, but the seizures were unpredictable and could not always be controlled. Before leaving, her daughter arranged for Carol to receive a trained seizure alert service dog through a certified assistance animal organization. The dog had been matched to Carol based on her specific seizure pattern and had lived with her for several months by the time the trouble with the neighbor began. The dog stayed close to Carol throughout the day. It had been trained to detect subtle physiological changes that often preceded one of her seizures and alert her by pressing against her leg and refusing to move. The warning usually gave Carol several minutes to take emergency medication and move away from hard floors or sharp furniture. On 2 occasions since the dog arrived, the alert had given her enough time to reach a safe position before a seizure occurred. The neighbor, who lived 2 houses down, began complaining in late July. He said the dog sometimes barked in the backyard at night when sounds came from the alley behind the houses. Carol explained that the dog was a medically trained seizure alert service animal and that the alerts could prevent serious injury. A second conversation in August ended badly. Days later, Carol filed a formal noise complaint after the neighbor began playing loud music late at night. The complaint resulted in a municipal fine, and the neighbor blamed Carol for it. On the evening of September 2nd, Carol was inside her home while the dog was in the fenced backyard. At some point, the neighbor approached the fence line from his side of the property and threw several pieces of food into the yard. The dog consumed them. Within an hour, the animal became lethargic and began vomiting. Carol drove him to an emergency veterinary clinic. Despite treatment through the night, the dog died before morning. The veterinarian collected tissue and stomach content samples for toxicology testing. Laboratory analysis later confirmed the presence of a toxic substance. Carol returned home without him. Her daughter offered to come visit, but Carol said it was not necessary. In the weeks that followed, Carol did not experience another seizure, and her medication appeared to be keeping the condition temporarily stable. She contacted the assistance animal organization about obtaining another dog, but was told that matching and training a new seizure alert service animal could take 6 months or longer. Carol believed she could manage in the meantime with medication and caution. 3 weeks later, on the morning of September 24th, Carol experienced a seizure while alone in her living room. Without the dog, there was no alert and no warning. She collapsed and struck her head on the edge of the coffee table as she fell, suffering a severe head injury. That evening, her daughter called repeatedly and received no answer. Concerned, she contacted the police and explained that her mother had epilepsy, lived alone, and had recently lost her seizure alert dog. Officers conducted a welfare check and entered the home. They found Carol unresponsive in the living room. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be fatal head trauma sustained during an unsupervised seizure. Following Carol's death, investigators revisited the earlier poisoning of the service dog. Detectives documented the prior dispute between Carol and her neighbor over the noise complaint that had resulted in a fine. Veterinary toxicology results confirmed the dog had ingested poisoned food. Further investigation determined that the neighbor had thrown the food into Carol's yard on the night of September 2nd. He was arrested in October 2015. Prosecutors filed charges including criminal damage to a service animal and involuntary manslaughter. Court records later showed he was convicted and sentenced to several years in state prison.